All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Scott Lincicome, Vice President and Head of the Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute here in fabulous Washington, D.C. Welcome to Free the Economy, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
So I've heard recently, and a lot of wise people have been telling me that tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also fail to achieve their primary aims and foster political dysfunction along the way.
Yeah, I've heard that.
That phrase about free trade and tariffs became something of a viral slogan on social media of all places a while back. Can you tell us a little bit about how that happened and how people started wearing T-shirts with that phrase on it?
Yeah, sure. It was a complete stroke of luck and a kind of classic viral Twitter thing. What really happened was I was simply reading the news on a Saturday morning, as I often do, and saw some tweet that essentially showed a woman with a T-shirt that said something to the effect of "tariffs are good." And it was at a Trump rally. And of course, this was kind of depressing. And I jokingly responded that we need to make our own T-shirt saying the reality, and made the phrase "tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also foster political dysfunction along the way," or whatever it is. I can't even remember it. In jest, to kind of hit home the idea that protectionists have this very easy slogan, trade kills jobs or whatever, and then we free traders respond with this very long-winded academic response. So I thought that was kind of the end of it, and then a fellow Twitter follower actually produced T-shirts for Amazon and said, actually, I want to turn this into a T-shirt. And so we spent a very short amount of time putting the text on a shirt and putting a big deadweight loss graph on the back, really to hammer home the nerdery aspect of this. And the next thing you know, we sold a lot of shirts. I don't know the final numbers, but it was certainly, I think, into the thousands. And every once in a while, we'll see someone wearing one still. And that was, now, gosh, more than 5 years ago.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of funny because there's two parts to it. So there's the joke that of course is a much longer phrase than like a snappy 3 or 4 word phrase,
right?
But it actually packs quite a lot of explanation into a single sentence at the same time. So it's actually a very snappy version of a 1-page explanation of why tariffs don't work.
Right. And it was actually cribbed from a paper I wrote in 2017, I believe, on the long history of protectionist failures in the United States. So if you pull up the paper, you'll actually see that the T-shirt was a paraphrased version of the introductory executive summary of that paper.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this gives hope to all of the think tankers out there that
yes,
your academic papers, your white papers don't have to stop there. They can become fashion trends.
Right.
If you work hard and really believe.
Yeah, and get lucky. Right. That's of course the other thing that had people not been sitting around on a Saturday morning goofing around with their coffee, it would have been just something into the void. I'm pretty prolific on Twitter and don't really strategically place most of my tweets. They just come when I'm thinking of something or when I'm watching a ball game and just happen to have my phone open. So that was you need a little bit of luck as well as the clear skill that was involved in my T-shirt work.
Clearly the rule to follow: never stop posting. Never stop posting.
Yes, for sure. That's 100%.
All right, so we've talked a lot on the show here at Free the Economy about how a lot of well-intentioned efforts to help American workers, if some of them are not so well-intentioned, but even the well-intentioned efforts to help American workers find good jobs often end up backfiring and causing more harm than good, much like the trade tariffs themselves. So even when those problems are often clear to economists, including multiple generations of economists, politicians often keep doubling down with the same failed policies because if nothing else, they want to be seen as, quote, doing something. You got to do something. You got to be seen as doing something. So if all of these things, minimum wages, buy American mandates, tariffs, cutting immigration, of all these aren't going to do the trick to help American workers. What is the short list of those policies that is going to do it?
Well, I mean, I have a whole book behind me here that has 17 chapters worth of policies. The long and short of it, I think, is that the vast majority of pro-worker policy in the United States, whether it is tariffs or industrial policy or wage subsidies or benefits mandates or whatever, is in reality just layering another layer of government stuff on top of this existing pile of government stuff, and is oftentimes a direct response to the distortions in our economy, in the labor market, that pre-existing pile of stuff has created. And the problem with, I think, most pro-worker policy, not all, but most, is that it totally ignores that pile of stuff. So what we did at Cato, and what I set out to do in thinking of this book and then editing and co-authoring a lot of it, is to actually focus on the pile of stuff. And that is to examine the, academic literature from folks on the left and the right to really drill into what are well, first of all, what do workers really care about? What do they want, right? Who are the American worker? I mean, that's the other thing, right? In Washington, the American worker is like, it's a dude in a hard hat who works at a factory and is a sole breadwinner, probably has a mustache, or it's some single cohabitating urbanite female or whatever, and they totally ignore that the vast majority of the workforce is nothing like that. That workers have all sorts of disparate hopes and dreams and job opportunities, and they want to live in different places and all that. So what we set out to do is actually meet workers where they are. So what do workers care about? What do they want? And where are the existing policies that are preventing that from happening? And then what are the kind of pro-market reforms we can implement to actually help workers have better lives and higher pay and all this kind of stuff? So sorry, that was a very long-winded intro to your question, but the chapters that we handle hit the kind of classic labor market stuff, right? So we look at labor regulation, whether it's minimum wage laws or forced unionization laws or those types of things. And then other classic labor market issues like occupational licensing, right? That really restricts the ability of individuals to enter into certain professions or move from place to place. But then we also, I think, expand out to some not less traditional areas. We look at criminal justice policy, for example, and then look at some issues that weren't traditionally on the radar for labor policy, but are today really important, like remote work and independent contracting. And then finally, we look at a lot of policies that people talk about, but they don't really talk about them in terms of how they affect workers and the labor force. So housing is, of course, a huge one. Childcare is another. Healthcare and in benefits. Again, these are things are discussed, but oftentimes not from kind of a worker-centric view, but certainly not from a pro-market, free market view. And so the idea is that, look, we need to reform or eliminate these policies that raise the price of living, of everyday goods and services, that prevent workers, again, from moving from job to job or place to place, do all these things. And then let's look at some smart reforms that not only are just repealing those things, but also that are some more innovative ideas, like universal savings accounts to help workers save for when bad things happen, or to train for a new job, or the criminal justice reform, embracing automatic expungement of criminal records after a short period of time, because criminal records keep people out of the labor market or keep them from applying for different jobs and the rest. So certainly not just repealing stuff, but embracing, again, a kind of more market-oriented approach to help all workers, not just the few that are favored in Washington.
Yeah, that I think that is a approach that is often ignored. Often ignored, the idea that, well, we have a pile of bad policies already that are causing problems. The solution isn't yet another policy on top of that.
Yeah.
Even if that extra layer might do something good, we should start by digging out what's causing the problems in the first
Well,
place.
yeah, yeah. And the reason for that, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's really important to note. The reason for that is that, most folks justify new government policy, not all, but most folks, on the basis of some sort of market failure, right? The market has failed to provide cheap and affordable housing for workers, or affordable childcare, or whatever, healthcare, the rest. But the market failure premise doesn't hold if it's actually the problems that you're seeing are actually the result of government policy, right? So you have to first peel back the government policy, and then we can decide whether there really is a market failure that, constitutional constraints and the rest notwithstanding, might justify some sort of government intervention. If, on the other hand, all you do is say, aha, there's a problem. Problems exist, and you say, aha, and my solution is more spending, more mandates, more whatever. Unfortunately, the time and time again, we say that really isn't going to make things better. Maybe it'll make things better for a few folks, but for the vast majority of people, it's just going to make things worse. And quite frankly, it's going to have all sorts of unintended consequences that we can't even really map out, right?
Mm-hmm. Political dysfunction, possibly.
Yes, for sure.
So one thing I think is really interesting is when it comes to fixing problems in politics, we often look for targeted solutions. So if you have a workforce problem, you need a workforce solution.
Yeah.
But as you sort of got into some of the things that play into workforce development, that's not always necessarily the case. There can be other things which are sort of off to the side, but still have a big impact on the thing we're talking about. And I think back to a couple papers that my colleagues Ian Murray and Ryan Young wrote all the way back in 2016, when everyone was talking about Professor Piketty and his book about inequality. And his sort of thesis is that, well, a market economy inevitably leads to terrible income disparities, and we need to fix that. And so Ryan and Ian wrote two papers, actually. One is called People Not Ratios, which is saying, well, we shouldn't be worried about the quote, the Gini coefficient, this mathematical way of measuring inequality. That number is not really the point. We need to look at whether people are just having good lives and jobs in general. But then the other one was the rising tide. So this was sort of like the solutions.
Yeah.
If this is in fact a problem at all, well, how would we fix it? And their list of solutions, like Empowering the American Worker has 17 chapters of solutions. They had a list of solutions as well. And one of them, the first one, is sound monetary policy.
Yeah.
So that's not an obvious fix to workforce development and employment, but you could say it's one of those underlying things to a successful economy that is essential, but maybe ignored.
Yeah, and that's actually the very first chapter in my book, is on ensuring a sound macroeconomic foundation for everything else, right? I mean, there is, in a lot of ways, this kind of politician do no harm type mandate that growth is good. Per capita GDP is a messy metric, but in general correlates with not only living standards, but all sorts of other important non-financial things, whether it's mortality or happiness or whatever. And we generally know that per capita GDP is linked to productivity growth. And we generally know not how to boost productivity growth, but we know how to really hurt it, right?
Right.
So the first chapter is like, look, there is a part of pro-worker policy is just having a growing, healthy economy. And we know that a growing, healthy economy has, a strong rule of law and a relatively fluid labor market and some, modest regulation and clear rules and all that kind of stuff, right? And so that's kind of you have to do this first, or the rest of this doesn't even matter, right? You're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And so it's certainly very important that you start with that macro point, and then you start getting into the weeds on the specific policies and issues that matter at the smaller, kind of the micro level.
Right. So let's go back for a second to what you said about how the workforce has changed since the 1950s, right? So,
Yeah.
So I think a lot of our, our friends on the right, or sort of populist nationalist friends who are, want to be pro-worker, have a sort of nostalgic, almost certainly somewhat outdated view of what the American workforce is like, certainly the blue-collar workforce. And so I think, if you put those statistics together on a page, we can agree that yes, the workforce has changed significantly in 70 years. But what do we say to people who say, well, that's the problem? That's exactly the problem. And we want to return spelled with a V in that
right.
meme of going back to earlier stage of civilization. We want to return to the economy of 1957. That's our whole goal. That's the whole point, right? Why is that not a good idea?
Well, it's not I mean, first, it's undeniable that a lot of people weren't better off in the 1950s. And, women, minorities, there were a lot of folks. I mean, let's leave aside for a minute the kind of sole breadwinner male that is the focus of so much pro-worker policy on the left and especially on the right. That totally ignores, of course, right, all of the folks that were almost in many cases directly harmed by the economy of the 1950s. Okay, so that's, I think you have to acknowledge a lot of that this nostalgia completely overlooks that you had a huge chunk of the labor force that was in no way doing great. Right. The second thing that I think is critical is to also understand that, the post-war economy in the United States is a historical anomaly, right? You had in the United States a very, very unique confluence of events, both in the baby boom, so this kind of domestic demographic surge, but also in the kind of unique positioning of the United States economy after 2 world wars and half the global economy voluntarily deciding to punch itself in the face via communism, right? So we took like a huge chunk of the world's productive capacity offline. And that made the United States and US manufacturers and US workers distinctly powerful for a unique period of time, something that just never existed before in history. And so some of the relative decline in whether it's US manufacturing prowess or worker bargaining power or whatever has nothing to do with economic policy or anything. It deals with this very unique moment in time, one that we really don't want to try to recreate. I don't want World War III to try to get us back on top of the pile of rubble, right? But then finally, when you really dig into the data on wages and living standards and the rest, it remains undeniably true that for the vast majority of American workers today, and of course, pandemic makes things go down a little bit, but the long-term trend for workers' living standards and wages and the rest is up, right? It's trending upward. That today workers are better off in terms of purchasing power, in terms of their earnings, in terms of most things than they were 40, 50 years ago. And there's reams of economic data to show that. It is not merely something for the 1% either. Low wage workers as well, particularly in the last few years. And so this kind of idea that things were better off is mainly and I should note, of course, there are some people who aren't doing great, right? But for the vast majority of workers, for the median worker in the United States, things are better. And it's essential that we recognize that, and recognize that a lot of this is just kind of misguided nostalgia for a past that didn't really even exist.
Right. And I think it's important to, both halves of that, which is there were people who were functionally excluded from the labor market to begin with in unfair ways in the 1950s. But also, if you look at the real dollar GDP, everyone is better off now.
Yeah.
And this is, like you said, some of this, recent number crunching has come from, people like our number 2 guest, our very second episode, Michael Strain of AEI.
Yeah.
And from his book, The American Dream is Not Dead, which I think you quote some of that stuff in the introduction to Empowering the American Worker, saying that there was the softening of growth or decline in like blue collar work. There was some of that, but it was almost 20 years ago at this point, right?
Oh yeah.
And so you have some people who were looking at this data. We know people who have been doing this game of writing about economics and public policy for 40 years, and I feel like sometimes they get stuck on a narrative, and then the data keeps changing, and then they don't change along with it. And even just in the very recently in our post-pandemic recovery, we've seen strong wage growth at the bottom of earners, people with more modest incomes. In fact, it's sort of the sort of like V-shaped recovery we've had is disproportionately benefiting lower wage workers proportionally to their starting income. So when we talk about this sort of like 1950s nostalgia view of the workforce, I think this goes pretty deep. We might not have time to figure it all out today, but part of this debate about the future of work and the economy is obviously about economics, but a lot of it I think is about culture and identity, the things that one of the reasons why people are not persuaded by the figures, by the facts and figures, is that facts and figures didn't get them to the position they're in to begin with. Right. So for example, when, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who's talked a lot about this stuff, about populist economics and wanting to be pro-worker. So he was talking about this during the 2016 presidential campaign, among other times. And he specifically said at one point that expecting a former factory worker or a former coal miner to, quote, learn to code was insulting. It would be contemptuous to say that someone who used to be a coal miner should learn to write computer code. And so the logical part of my brain says, well, why? That doesn't make any sense. If you could get retrained for a job that's in higher demand, has a higher salary, and is safer, that sounds like an awesome pivot to your career. If you could set that up. But I think in the back of our minds, we kind of get what he's saying? Do we sort of understand that there's something there, and that like the muscular power to being working class American male is somehow super important in ways that we usually don't say out loud? Like, is there like a workforce machismo crisis in America?
No. No. And so I think that certainly the critique from the populist right has a nugget of truth to it, right? That, look, there's no doubt that the prominence of manufacturing work in the United States economy has declined over the last century. The fact is that, it basically peaked in the 1950s as a share of the workforce, manufacturing jobs, and then peaked in nominal terms in about 1979. So it's undeniably true that we've lost manufacturing jobs, and that as a share of the workforce as well. So that's true. And then I think there's a nugget of truth to the idea that it is not easy for people to retrain, and change is hard. There's no doubt about that. And so I think that we can have sympathy, and public policy can target workers, particularly older workers who have spent 20 plus years doing a certain type of work, and that type of work is suddenly either obsolete or becomes, far less valuable in terms of purchasing power and wages and that kind of stuff. So I think we can agree on that. But there's a lot of problems with the thesis too. One is blaming public policy for these things is pretty loopy. The fact is that if you look at manufacturing jobs all over the world, including in places that have big surpluses like Japan and Germany, so big trade surpluses, active labor market policies, again, looking at a place like Germany, or for example, and even in China now, what you see is that all countries go through the same type of economic development. They gain a bunch of manufacturing jobs and they start losing a bunch of manufacturing jobs. And that's particularly true today, even in developing economies, because manufacturing is just so capital intensive now. Except on the lowest of the low end. And so you're seeing a lot of developing economies that are almost skipping that peak in manufacturing jobs, and development economists are actually worried about that, right? That they're skipping that stage of industrialization. So this general decline in manufacturing jobs is not a primarily a public policy issue, whether it's trade policy or industrial policy or whatever. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that there is no shortage of manufacturing work in the United States. We remain the second largest manufacturing nation on the planet. Even now, job openings in the manufacturing sector, which is a rough metric, but still 6, 7, 800,000 job openings in the United States. Workers that are out of work do not report that they can't find a job. There's even though male labor force participation has declined for lesser educated males, it is not primarily because a lack of labor demand for these big manly jobs. And speaking of that, as I wrote in the book, there are roughly 4 times as many male-dominated blue-collar jobs in services than there are in manufacturing. And the nature of manufacturing work anyway is changing to more kind of a services, the guy that repairs the robot instead of the guy who stamps the fender. So you put all of that together and you realize that, this idea that we need to restore the United States to some sort of manufacturing job glory in order to help this discrete part of the population it's just nonsense, right? It's just not reality. And then finally, again, as the book reinforces, it ignores all of the ways that current policy harms the very workers that we're trying to help. A very simple example of this is steel tariffs, right? So steel tariffs might help 70,000 steel workers in the United States. The only problem is that there are about 50 times as many workers in industries that consume steel as there are steel workers. So you're harming all of those steel consuming manufacturing workers just to help a sliver of steel workers, right? And studies routinely show that tariff policy has these kind of broader harms. But there's all sorts of other policies that similarly harm the vast majority of the workforce, preventing them from training for a new job, for saving up for a rainy day, from moving out of that town that just hasn't gotten its act together. Most of them have, by the way. Yes, the China shock happened. Yes, there are some mill towns have died, but the vast majority of them have moved on and are doing quite well today. And so, there are all these policies that prohibit workers from making the adjustments that workers have to make, that any workers have to make in a dynamic economy. And that is really important that we maintain a level of job churn. Freezing workers in a certain job or certain place is bad for them. It's bad for the economy, all these things. So we don't want that. we need to help workers adjust. And there are all these policies that just as the world was getting super disrupted with the internet and with trade and all these things, we were making it really, really hard for workers to just get on with their lives. And so that's where public policy should focus. It shouldn't focus in trying to invent a time machine and get everybody back to 1955.
Mm-hmm. Although I would invest in that startup. If you've got a working prototype.
Well, yes. I mean, look, then we take care of baby Hitler and we're good, right? But reality, unfortunately, is a tough nut to crack.
So you also mentioned in the book Empowering the New American Worker that more Americans are going out on their own and making good money doing so. So just like we've been talking about with the kind of like old model of industrial policy and labor policy, a lot of government efforts were aimed at helping workers are assuming that they'll be in traditional jobs working for large firms, whether it's manufacturing or something else. But if the future is going to include more freelancers and entrepreneurs, including white collar freelancers,
right.
In addition to Uber Eats drivers and everybody else, wouldn't that also suggest a whole different set of solutions, right? Because
yeah, for sure.
So on the one hand, as you already mentioned, you could do things like repeal occupational licensing rules and restrictions. But it seems like a lot of some of our political leaders, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, they want a sort of like a model where everything is run through industrial unions. It's the 1930s all over again, industrial policy. And if you just put a worker representative on the board of a Fortune 500 company, that will like make capitalism fair.
Right.
What do we change specifically to help this entrepreneurship economy?
Yeah, sure. So let me just start by saying that, like you said, there is this segment of the left and some on the right that kind of want to lock workers into a job for life, right? And it's going to be through the union, and they're going to get all their benefits through the union or through the company, and then the union negotiates it and the rest. And that's it, right? You kind of freeze them in amber and they're done, right? As I noted, and as we note in the book, that is actually really bad for workers' lifetime earnings growth. It's bad for national economic growth and productivity growth. It's a kind of recipe for sclerosis and a slow economy that not only doesn't grow quickly, but also struggles when disaster strikes, right? When there's a big economic shock. If you look at Germany right now, if you look at South Korea right now, these were kind of top-heavy manufacturing-led economies with a lot of active industrial policy. COVID-19 has hurt them a lot more than the more fluid United States economy that has allowed resources to reallocate somewhat more quickly. So we don't want that. But second, like you said, a lot of people, just in terms of sheer desire, they want to be independent. They don't want a boss. The surveys show that not only has the contract workforce grown dramatically, or freelance workforce, now something like 60 million people are engaged in some sort of freelance work last year. But also the problem is that policy hasn't really kept up. And I think the big theme here is portability, right? So if you have your health insurance through your employer, you get a tax break. And that is going to essentially funnel most health insurance through employers. And these group plans have certain benefits to them along with the tax breaks. But that makes it more difficult to leave that job. It makes it more painful when if you get fired. And it makes no sense from the worker's perspective, right? You don't have control over the type of benefits you get or whatever, right? And so a core theme of the book is to increase portability of benefits, whether it is health or retirement or whatever. I mentioned universal savings accounts so that you get to decide how you're allocating your your spending. So maybe you want a Cadillac health plan, maybe you don't, right? Your employer's not going to decide that for you. And if you change jobs, or if you want to go out on your own and be an entrepreneur, if you want to move to another state, whatever, you can just do that, right? You don't have to worry about taking your benefits with you, or your loss of coverage for yourself or your families. That is a huge area for reform. And again, not just for repealing stuff that there are some things like that. The tax exclusion for health insurance needs to go, but it's also about, in reforming policy that makes it easier for workers to do all those things I mentioned. And then finally, of course, we need to stop kind of the war on independent contractors by the mainly by the left, right? That trying to implement this California style AB5 rule that effectively turns everybody into a wage slave is bad. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for the workers who don't want to do it. A bunch of port truckers were protesting out in California because they didn't want to be members of the Teamsters. They wanted to be owner operator truckers. And there's a lot of people like that out there. And, so we need to avoid those types of laws that essentially force them to work in a way they don't want to work.
Sounds smart to me.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, thank you for a great conversation. This has been fantastic.
My
and
pleasure.
Before we go, where can everyone find you out there on the internet?
Well, the most obvious place is over at the Cato Institute, cato.org. You can find my name there. And then I am obsessively tweeting at Scott Lincicome.
As we should all be.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, thank you. And I wish you the best of luck with your future career and work.